Hey everyone, this is a piece titled Capitalism, Socialism, Barbarism, Marxist Conceptions of the Soviet Union by Kevin D. Kelly. It's from the Review of Radical Political Economics from Volume 17, Issue 4, 1985. This is the abstract. This paper examines the three original Marxist conceptions of the Soviet Union, which correspond to the split of Marxism into its Kautskyist, Stalinist, and Trotskyist variants. The origin of the terminology used in each framework is examined. The background assumptions and way of thinking in each framework are explicated. It is argued that recent conceptions of the Soviet Union by Miloty, 1977, Sweezy, 1980, and Barra, 1978, tend to replicate the way of thinking of Kautsky, Stalin, and Trotsky. Okay, that's the end of the abstract. Now the introduction. In classical Marxism, there was postulated a close relation between the level of development of the productive forces and the kinds of social relations which were possible. Socialism was conceived as a post-capitalist society which would emerge from capitalism at a higher stage of development of the productive forces. Classical Marxism saw the development of capitalism as creating the prerequisites for socialism. Capitalism would, by transforming the bulk of the population into wage laborers, create a working class majority so that the working class would become the most powerful social force in developed countries, thus making a socialist revolution politically possible. At the same time, capitalism would develop the productive forces, which include the cultural level of the working class. This would allow the elimination of scarcity and the need for some to perform surplus labor so that others could be free from work. That is, the development of capitalism would create the social force which would overthrow capitalism and the objective prerequisites which would allow the construction of socialism. Proletarian social forces would become stronger than bourgeois social forces as the prerequisites for socialism emerged within the womb of capitalism. A major dilemma in Marxist theory in the 20th century centers around the fact that the first socialist revolutions occurred not in the center, developed advanced countries of the capitalist world system, but rather in several periphery, underdeveloped backward countries. Closely connected to this problem is the perpetual debate about the nature of the societies that resulted from these revolutions, especially the Soviet Union. As is well known, Marxists have characterized the Soviet Union as 1. A socialist society, 2. A state capitalist society, 3. A bureaucratized transition society, and 4. A new kind of class society. In most of the analyses, theorists take for granted certain background assumptions which shape their attempt to come to grips with the great albatross of modern Marxism. Terms like, quote, socialism, quote, transition society, quote, state, and even, quote, class are given different meanings by different theorists so that it is not even clear what many of the debates are about. This paper examines a point which is often ignored in the debates about the nature of the USSR. Fundamental to the way the Soviet Union is approached are the initial assumptions that are made about how to deal with the problem that the first socialist revolution occurred where the prerequisites for socialism did not exist. 3 different answers were given to this problem, leading to 3 different conceptions of the Soviet Union, which can be called, after the major original or proponent of each, the Kautskyist, Stalinist, and Trotskyist conceptions. The 3 different positions on the Soviet Union correspond to the split of Marxism into its Kautskyist, Stalinist, and Trotskyist variants. The first position asserts that, since the prerequisites for socialism did not exist, the attempt to have a socialist revolution was adventurous. Basically, this position denies that the revolution was socialist. Where the prerequisites for socialism do not exist, socialist revolutions are impossible since, at the level of development, only bourgeois revolutions and the establishment of capitalism are possible. Thus, the Russian Revolution is seen as a bourgeois revolution that emerges, the bourgeois revolution, and what emerges is state capitalism. This is the position taken by Kautsky and adopted by most social democrats. This position retains the notion that socialism is a post-capitalist society, and that the process of creating the prerequisites for socialism can only be accomplished by capitalism. Thus, the Soviet Union is a special kind of capitalism, and the apparent contradiction is resolved. The second position asserts that, since a socialist revolution occurred, state power was taken by a working class party, what emerges from the revolution must be socialism. Socialist revolutions lead to the establishment of socialism. This was the position taken by Stalin and adopted by Stalinists and various non-Stalinist fellow travelers. What emerges in the Soviet Union is socialism. The definition of socialism is shaped by what exists in the Soviet Union. So socialism becomes the process of industrializing an underdeveloped country through state ownership of the means of production and a planned economy. Once again, the contradiction is resolved, but, obviously, in a different manner than in the first position. The third position asserts that a socialist revolution, where the prerequisites for socialism do not exist, creates an objective contradiction, which can be resolved either by a counter-revolution, which leads to capitalism, or the continuation of the revolution, so that the prerequisites for socialism are created. Since capitalism is a world system, the prerequisites for socialism are created on a world level, so that socialism can only be constructed on a world level. This is the position taken by Trotsky and defended today by Ernest Mandel. What emerges in the Soviet Union is a contradictory social formation which cannot be characterized as either capitalist or socialist. Kautsky's conception of the Soviet Union. The most, quote, orthodox, end quote, of the Marxist positions on the Soviet Union was the one developed by Kautsky, since Kautsky was the, quote, pope of the Marxism which existed before the revolution. As we will see, Kautsky maintained the position that the full development of capitalism was necessary to create the prerequisites for socialism. Kautsky also emphasized the importance of bourgeois democracy as a training ground for the working class and the importance of democracy in the idea of socialism. Kautsky's conception of the Soviet Union was conditioned by his general outlook on the relationship between economic development, democracy, and socialism. A bourgeois democratic revolution would, 1. Open the way for the development of capitalism by eliminating the remnants of feudal relations in the countryside. 2. Create the conditions for the political and cultural maturity of the working class by establishing the democratic republic. The working class must mature in the context of capitalist development through the exercise of political and civil liberties in the democratic republic. Capitalism creates the prerequisites for socialism by creating large-scale advanced industry and a working-class majority. However, this by itself is not sufficient unless the working class develops the political and cultural maturity necessary to overthrow capitalism and to run the new socialist society which will replace capitalism. This is a quote. Quote, it says Salvadori 1979. I'm not sure then if this is a quote by Kautsky or a quote from Salvadori. Not sure. Maybe we'll figure it out as we read it. Quote, the more capitalistic a state is on the one hand, and the more democratic on the other, the closer that state is to socialism. The further the development of its capitalist industry, the higher its productivity, and the greater its wealth, the more socialized is its labor, and the more numerous its proletariat. The more democratic a state, the better organized and trained is its working class, end quote. Salvadori, 1979. A bourgeois revolution, which creates the conditions for the development of capitalism, can establish different kinds of states involving different degrees of democracy. The ideal form of state for the working class is the democratic republic, since the democratic republic permits the fullest development of the political strength and maturity of workers. The bourgeoisie, on the other hand, does not require the democratic republic and will often support the establishment of an authoritarian Bonapartist state. Capitalism can develop in the Bonapartist state, but the political and cultural maturity of the working class is hindered. Thus, the Marxist evaluation of a bourgeois revolution centers around whether or not it establishes the democratic republic as the form of state within which capitalism develops. Kautsky saw the February Revolution in Russia as the beginning of a bourgeois revolution. Further, Kautsky supported the October Revolution since the Bolsheviks claimed that they would convene the Constituent Assembly. Convening the Constituent Assembly, adopting a constitution, and establishing the Democratic Republic were the necessary steps in creating the conditions for the development of capitalism and the political maturity of the working class. When the Bolsheviks abolished the Constituent Assembly and did not establish a parliamentary republic, Kautsky withdrew his support of the revolution and developed a critique of the Russian state. For Kautsky, the Bolshevik Revolution was a bourgeois revolution since the prerequisites for socialism did not exist. Since the prerequisites for socialism did not exist, the Bolsheviks could maintain power only by using reactionary bourgeois methods in establishing a Bonapartist state. Before the revolution, the state had been pressing industrialization from above in the form of state capitalism. The revolution, by eliminating feudal relations in the countryside, allowed the further development of state capitalism, but this did not constitute a major change from what had been developing before. By abolishing the Constituent Assembly and preventing the establishment of a democratic republic, the Bolsheviks had acted in a reactionary manner and aborted the development of the revolution. That is, what happened in Russia was similar to what happened in France in 1848. A Bonapartist state had been established which would promote the development of state capitalism while politically crushing the population, including the working class. Thus, Kautsky's conception of the Soviet Union involved two elements. Economically, what existed was state capitalism, a continuation of what had been developed before the revolution. Politically, what existed was an extreme form of Bonapartist dictatorship. The Bonapartist bureaucracy had completely replaced the bourgeoisie and had converted itself into a new ruling class, which is pushing the development of state capitalism. The state bureaucracy and the bureaucracy of capitalism had merged into a single whole, creating a capitalism without a capitalist class. The place of the capitalist class had been taken by the new bureaucratic class. Without democracy, nationalization of the means of production could not produce socialism since the working class was excluded from control of the means of production through a lack of political power. The authoritarian state prevented the development of the political maturity of the working class, so that what resulted was worse than the capitalism which existed in the West. Another revolution would be necessary to overthrow the Bonapartist state and establish a republic. Lenin's conception of Soviet Russia. Both the Stalinist and Trotskyist positions developed from within the Leninist variant of Marxism. The terminology used in both positions derives from that developed by Lenin in his analysis of Marx's critique of the Gotha program. Consequently, it will be useful to look at the terminology used by Lenin in State and Revolution. 1 second. Anyway, consequently, it would be useful to look at the terminology used by Lenin in State and Revolution, and to look at Lenin's conception of Russia between the October Revolution and Lenin's death. This will be done to show that both Stalin and Trotsky's conceptions of Russia were drawn from Lenin's initial analysis. It should be obvious that the accuracy of any conception of the Soviet Union is not determined by its faithfulness to Lenin. Further, there is no way we can know how Lenin might have conceptualized the nature of the Soviet Union after the collectivization of the peasants. We can, however, see how Lenin tried to make sense of the Russian social formation after the revolution and how that affected conceptions developed within the Leninist variants of Marxism. This is all that is relevant here.
In Chapter 5 of The State and Revolution, Lenin laid out his conception of the phases involved in the movement from capitalism to communism. After a section on Marx's presentation of the question, there are 3 sections discussing 3 phases in this process. The 3 sections are titled The Transition from Capitalism to Communism, the first phase of communist society, the higher phase of communist society. In discussing the first phase of communist society, Lenin notes that this phase is usually called socialism. Throughout his writings, Lenin uses the term socialism to mean the lower stage of communism. Quote, what is usually called socialism was termed by Marx the, quote, first, end quote, or lower phase of communist society. Insofar as the means of production become common property, the word, quote, communism, end quote, is also applicable here, providing we do not forget that this is not complete communism, end quote. Lenin. Given this usage of the terms, Lenin can talk about the transition period as the transition to socialism. Since socialism is the lower stage of communism, Lenin also can speak of the transition to communism. Thus, quote, the transition to socialism, end quote, and the, quote, transition to communism, end quote, both mean the transition to the lower phase of communism. Socialism, the lower phase of communism, then, is a social formation in which the means of production are owned by the state and do not become commodities. There are no classes or class struggle, but there still exists social inequality and a social division of labor. The mental/manual division of labor still exists, but this is not theorized by either Marx or Lenin as a class relation. Distribution takes place on the basis of the amount of work performed, so bourgeois rights still exists. Only in the second phase of communism do all forms of social inequality and social division of labor wither away. The movement from the lower phase to the higher phase of communism, the process of eliminating the mental/manual division of labor, is not theorized as a class struggle. The transition, dictatorship of the proletariat, from capitalism to communism is a formation in which remnants of classes, class struggle, commodity production, and money economy still exist. The transition period, then, does involve class struggle. Lenin does not use the term, quote, socialism, end quote, for the transition itself, but rather, as we have seen, for the result of the transition. Lenin, during the period from the October Revolution until his death, characterized the Russian social formation as a transitional formation. The October Revolution, by taking up the remnants of feudal relations in the countryside, had opened up the development of small commodity production which, as it produced differentiation of the peasantry, tends to produce the class relations of capitalism. From the rich peasants and from the merchants involved in exchange, a neo-bourgeoisie is produced. Quote, we in Russia, in the 3rd year since the overthrow of the bourgeoisie, are making the first steps in the transition from capitalism to socialism, or the lower stage of communism. Classes still remain, and will remain everywhere for years after the proletariat's conquest of power. ... The abolition of classes means not merely the ousting the landowners and capitalists. That is something we accomplished with comparative ease. It also means abolishing the small commodity producers, and they cannot be ousted or crushed. We must learn to live with them, end quote. Lenin. Since for Lenin, socialism meant the abolition of classes, in order to move in that direction, the differences between factory workers and peasants must be abolished by making workers of them all. This, however, was likely to take a great deal of time, so Lenin figured it would be fortunate if the grandchildren of his generation saw socialism. Given his Marxist heritage, Lenin could not have pictured a forced collectivization of the peasants. Russia, then, was conceived by Lenin as a transitional formation in which small commodity production would constantly create a neo-bourgeoisie, so that capitalist development was taking place in the context of a worker state. This was true even before the new economic policy, which increased this tendency. The dictatorship of the proletariat would continue to exist as long as the bourgeoisie was being recreated by the existence of commodity exchange and money. But the struggle against the bourgeoisie was not confined within the Russian nation-state. It was connected to the capitalist world system and the international bourgeoisie. Quote, the exploiters have been smashed but not destroyed. They still have an international base in the form of international capital, of which they are a branch, end quote. Lenin. The Russian state during the period of the dictatorship of the proletariat was, of course, seen by Lenin as a workers' state. However, Lenin became increasingly worried about the increasing bureaucratization of that state. As early as 1921, Lenin very carefully defined the Russian state as, quote, a workers' state with bureaucratic distortions, end quote. The bureaucratic distortions increased during the early 20s and were linked to the low level of development in the country. Soviet Russia was a transition society, not a transition society in the abstract, but rather one in which the prerequisites for socialism did not exist. Consequently, as the fact that Russia might remain isolated for some time became possible, Lenin thought in terms of creating the prerequisites for socialism in Russia. A worker state had been created before the prerequisites for socialism existed, so the main task became one of creating those prerequisites, which hadn't been created by capitalist development, in a parallel but different manner. Quote, if a definite level of culture is required for the building of socialism, why cannot we begin by first achieving the prerequisites for that definite level of culture in a revolutionary way? And then, with the aid of the workers' and peasants' government and the Soviet system, proceed to overtake the other nations. End quote. Lenin. Quote, we too lack enough civilization to enable us to pass straight on to socialism, although we do have the political requisites for it. End quote. Lenin. The transition society which existed in Lenin's Russia was one in which the prerequisites for socialism, usually created by capitalism, would have to be created in the context of a workers' state. Lenin's conception of the Russia created by the October Revolution was that it was a society in transition from capitalism to socialism, the lower phase of communism. Such a formation is a workers' state, but that state was bureaucratically deformed. Thus, we could sum up the nature of Lenin's Russia in the somewhat awkward formula. Bureaucratically deformed workers' states, or parenthesis, transition society, end parenthesis. To my understanding, that's precisely what Trotsky regarded it as. Bureaucrat, the word he used, degenerated, and viewed it as a transition society. Not quite socialism, but on its way to socialism, unless there was a bureaucratically led counter-revolution that reinstituted private property. Now we're at Stalin's conception of the Soviet Union. The major change which occurred in the USSR after Lenin's death was Stalin's forced collectivization of the peasants. Collectivizing the peasants eliminated small commodity production and the neo-bourgeoisie, mostly kulaks and netmen, which had thrived under the new economic policy. Stalin and his followers then declared that the USSR had abolished antagonistic classes and entered into socialism. To make their claim, it was necessary to 1. Ignore the bureaucratic domination by identifying the party-state bureaucracy with the working class. In my opinion, that's something that was already taking place under Lenin. 2. Assume that basic industrialization is the prerequisite for socialism. 3. Abstract the USSR from the capitalist world system. This then gave the Stalinist position that the complete victory of socialism had been achieved. The USSR was a socialist, classless, society. Within the Stalinist framework, state ownership of the means of production and a planned economy constitute socialism. The party-state bureaucracy automatically represented the working class, and in Stalinism, the concept of bureaucracy disappeared from Marxism. The continued existence of a huge state machine is attributed to threats to socialism. The state must remain strong in order to defend socialism against threats from both outside and inside. Since there are no antagonistic classes in the Soviet Union, it is not clear just what constitutes the inside threat, but it is possible that foreign agents are operating. Since Stalinists were in power in the Soviet Union and dominated communist parties everywhere, the Stalinists became accepted as the Marxist position and was even accepted by many non-Stalinists. Kautsky labeled a, quote, renegade, end quote, and Trotsky a, quote, traitor, end quote, could be ignored. The impact of the Stalinist position was so great that it was adopted by conventional social science, which has always been pleased to equate Stalinism with Marxism. For most conventional bourgeois non-Marxist social science, capitalism and socialism have become alternative ways to industrialize. Industrialism has become an independent variable which leads to many of the characteristics which Marxists attribute to capitalism. When confronted with a Marxist comment about capitalism, bourgeois social scientists chuckle and say, quote, "Oh, but that's a result of industrialization. After all, that exists in the Soviet Union as well as in capitalist countries," end quote. Within Stalinism and within conventional social science, socialism is what exists in the Soviet Union. This is written in 1985. Since public ownership plus planning equals socialism and both exist in the Soviet Union is obviously socialist. Definitions of socialism, which include an elimination of money and commodities, democratic control of production, and reduction of the realm of necessity, are rejected as, quote, idealist, end quote. Adjectives such as, quote, actually existing, end quote, and, quote, real, end quote, are placed in front of, quote, socialism, end quote, to overwhelm those who are critical with, quote, reality, end quote. There is imaginary socialism and there is real socialism, and what exists in the Soviet Union is real. Trotsky's conception of the Soviet Union. Why is it possible for the same social formation to be characterized both as capitalist and as socialist? One would think that Marxist theorists would be able to tell the difference without too much difficulty. Yet debates go on constantly with supporters of each position asserting that the other is obviously wrong. Either one or the other characterization must be totally at odds with the actual nature of the Soviet Union, or the actual nature of the Soviet Union must be contradictory, allowing theorists to characterize it either way by emphasizing some aspects of what exists rather than others. This section will focus on Trotsky's conception of the Soviet Union, its relation to his general theory of world revolution, and the contrast between this position and the other two. If the Soviet Union is seen as a contradictory formation, then it is not surprising that it is possible, by emphasizing some of the Soviet Union's characteristics rather than others, to construct several different pictures of the same phenomenon. Since classical Marxism saw a correspondence between the level of the productive forces and the social relations which were possible, it is not surprising that an attempted socialist revolution in a country where the productive forces were not highly developed created a great deal of confusion. Trotsky may well have been better prepared to accept a contradictory situation than were other Marxists because he had anticipated such an attempted socialist revolution more than a decade before it occurred. The first development of this idea was formulated by Trotsky after the 1905 revolution in Russia. It came to be known as the theory of permanent revolution and was developed around the notion of combined and uneven development leading to a combined and uninterrupted revolution. A summary of this theory in its later form will be useful in understanding Trotsky's analysis of the Soviet Union. Before the rise of capitalism, human history was characterized by uneven development. Consequently, various parts of the world were at different stages of development as capital emerged in the realm of circulation. This inherited unevenness served as the starting point of capitalism, which breaks and alters according to its own logic. As bourgeois democratic revolutions occur in different social formations within the world system, each is shaped by the internal contradictions of and the past history of each unique society. Due to the unevenness of development, revolutions occur in different countries at different stages in the historic development of the capitalist world system. Further, especially in the imperialist era, aspects of the more advanced societies are imported into the less advanced societies. As a result, elements of more advanced stages of development are combined with elements of less advanced stages, leading to combined and uneven development. In the age of imperialism, finance capital from the advanced countries promotes capitalist production in the less advanced countries, creating a combination of advanced capitalist production and pre-capitalist social forms. Backward countries are compelled by the logic of the world market and pressures from advanced nation states to follow the advanced countries. However, they do not simply repeat the history of the advanced countries, but are able to skip stages in the historic process and develop through leaps, thereby creating unexpected combinations of the old and the new. As revolutions occur in the 20th century, then, they do not simply repeat the forms of revolutions of 1789 or 1848. Combined and uneven development leads to a process in which, in backward countries, the political balance of forces as the bourgeois democratic revolution approaches is quite different than it was in the advanced countries. In the case of Russia, the balance of forces was quite different in 1917 than it had been in Western Europe in 1789 or 1848. This reflected both the unique history of the Russian social formation and the different stage of the world system in which the revolution occurred. The Russian bourgeoisie was weak both because of internal and external factors. Because the old Russian towns had been military administrative units rather than centers of industry and commerce, the political and cultural development of bourgeois forces was retarded. Russia lacked the concentrated mass of urban craftspeople who had played such an important role in the French Revolution. Since the Russian towns did not attain the political and cultural independence that had developed in Western Europe, the bourgeoisie did not have the consciousness and political organization of its Western counterparts. Further, in the age of imperialism, Russian capitalism was being fostered by foreign investment with the state pressing industrialization from above. The economic preponderance of the state, the numerical weakness of the middle classes, the predominance of foreign capital and industry, and the absence of a liberal tradition made the bourgeoisie incapable of leading a revolution. Although they do not always make it as they please, human beings do make history, and consequently, for major historical changes to take place, there must be social forces capable of acting as the subjects of history. Because of the factors mentioned, the Russian bourgeoisie was incapable of playing this role. Yet objective conditions required that some social force act as the subject of history if change were to occur. At the same time, the industrialization being pressed by the state and foreign capital was creating modern industrial working class, heavily concentrated in the cities. The political weight of the working class was greater than its numbers in the country as the whole would suggest. Therefore, the leadership of the bourgeois democratic revolution fell to the working class allied with the peasantry. Because the workers and peasants acquired a great deal of political power during the period of dual power, a contradiction developed between the economic power of the bourgeoisie and the political power of the proletariat. Consequently, the revolution grew immediately into a socialist revolution, became a combined and uninterrupted revolution. A socialist revolution in a backward country, however, creates a new problem. The very factors which make possible a socialist revolution also mean that the prerequisites for socialism do not exist. See Mandel, 1979. This contradiction can only be resolved if revolutions occur in the advanced European countries. The prerequisites for socialism exist on a world scale, but not in a single country, certainly not in a relatively backward one. The contradictions which befell a proletarian dictatorship in a backward country, surrounded by a world of capitalist enemies, can only be resolved in the process of world revolution. Therefore, the uneven development of capitalism on a world scale stretches the socialist revolution through an entire epoch during which nations will enter the process one after another. See Trotsky, 1970-22. Unevenness means it is not possible for revolution to occur everywhere at once. However, the organic interdependence of several countries, developing toward an international division of labor, means that socialism can be constructed only on a world scale. Socialism must take the most highly developed forces attained by the world development of capitalism and raise them to an even higher level. For Trotsky, capitalism and socialism are historical epochs conceived on a world scale. This is crucial in understanding his conception of the nature of the Soviet Union. Socialist revolutions can and must occur in single countries, but the development of socialism can only proceed from the highest level attained by capitalism on a world scale. Within his general framework of capitalism as a world system, Trotsky developed his analysis of the nature of the Soviet Union. The terminology Trotsky used in doing this is derived from Marx's critique of the Gotha program, and Lenin's analysis of this while he was writing State and Revolution. However, Trotsky reached a very different conclusion than that claimed by the Stalinists about the Soviet Union. Trotsky incorporated the analysis which Lenin developed into the general framework of the theory of permanent revolution, with its notions of combined and uneven development and combined and uninterrupted revolutions occurring within a capitalist world system. Again, there is no way of knowing whether or not Lenin would have developed a similar analysis, and speculation is not relevant to the discussion. What did develop within the Leninist variant of Marxism was a Stalinist position on the nature of the Soviet Union and Trotsky's critique of that position. Trotsky's analysis of the Soviet Union was based on a rejection of all the key elements of the Stalinist position. He did not ignore the bureaucratic domination and lack of prerequisites, which are seen as the reason for the bureaucratic domination, and Trotsky did not abstract the USSR from the capitalist world system. Trotsky, as we have seen, saw the Russian Revolution as a combined and uninterrupted revolution, and the possibility of a revolution which combines the tasks of a bourgeois democratic revolution and a socialist revolution only makes sense in the context of world capitalism. It was the position of Tsarist Russia in the capitalist world system which made a revolution of this sort possible, and the contradiction between the possibility of a socialist revolution and the lack of prerequisites for socialism in Russia could be resolved only on a world level. The lower phase of communism could only be entered at the highest level of development attained by capitalism before capitalism was overthrown. Quote, if Marx called that society which was formed upon the basis of a socialization of the productive forces of the most advanced capitalism of its epoch, the lowest stage of communism, then this designation obviously does not apply to the Soviet Union, which is still considerably poorer in technique, culture, and good things in life than the capitalist countries. It would be truer, therefore, to name the present Soviet regime in all its contradictoriness not a socialist regime, but a preparatory regime, transitional from capitalism to socialism, end quote. The USSR remained a transition society, albeit a different kind of transition society than before the collectivization of the peasants. Class struggle continued on an international level, and movement to the lower phase of communism, socialism, was not possible so long as classes and class struggle continued. Since the prerequisites for socialism did not exist in the Soviet Union, those prerequisites would have to be created while the struggle against capitalism continued. Rather than representing a, quote, higher, end quote, level of human development than capitalism, the Soviet Union represented a parallel but different development. Trotsky's argument that the USSR was not socialist was not based on the lack of democracy in the country, although that is important and has serious consequences. The USSR was not socialist because the USSR was part of a capitalist world system and because it did not represent the most developed part of that system, but rather a less developed part. A classless society cannot be constructed within a world dominated by capitalism, and cannot be constructed on a lower technical base than that achieved by capitalism. Although the Soviet Union, in Trotsky's analysis, is a transition society in the sense that the term was used by Marx and Lenin, see on this channel the paper titled "The Myth of the Transitional Society" by Adam Buick of the Socialist Party of Great Britain. Let me repeat the sentence. Although the Soviet Union, in Trotsky's analysis, is a transitional society in the sense that the term was used by Marx and Lenin, is not merely a transitional society conceived abstractly, but rather a transitional society constructed under conditions of low technical and cultural development. This presents difficulties which center around the bureaucratic domination of the society. In classical Marxism, the officials who occupy positions in the state bureaucracy are seen as a bureaucratic stratum. As Draper defines it, the bureaucracy is, quote, a social stratum of officials which is an instrument of rule from above in society, institutionally detached from the mass it is organized to manage, end quote. These officials are appointed from above rather than elected from below, and because these officials occupy positions in the bureaucracy on a permanent basis, are detached from the mass of the population. As Marx put it in his writings on the Paris Commune, quote, nothing could be more foreign to the spirit of the commune than to supersede universal suffrage by hierarchic investiture, end quote. This hierarchic investiture is the essence of bureaucracy. The bureaucratic stratum should not be viewed as a group of paper pushers. The definition of the Soviet bureaucracy is, quote, a social layer which comprises all those who exercise management, leadership, functions in the sector of Soviet social life, economy, state, army, science, arts, etc., end quote. Mandel. This includes the party bureaucracy, the whole officer corps and the armed forces, the entire planning hierarchy, directors and engineers, and the majority of the intelligentsia. The bureaucracy is not simply the leaders of each sector, but all those who exercise management, coordination functions. Thus, Trotsky's conception of the USSR involves two aspects. The USSR is a transitional formation, a workers' state, but that workers' state, due to the low level of development of the productive forces, is bureaucratically ruled. It is this second part of the formula which refers to the lack of democracy. The bureaucratic stratum which rules the USSR derives that stratum's power from a political monopoly, the one-party political system. Positions in the state bureaucracy are occupied on the basis of hierarchic investiture, the opposite of election from below. Development of the productive forces would not, by itself, solve the problem. Only the struggle of living social forces can change social relations. In order to eliminate the bureaucratic domination, a political revolution would be necessary to break the political monopoly of the bureaucracy and create a multi-party system so that officials are subject to election and recall. I don't know when Trotsky becomes a fan of or accepts multi-party system. I think it's later. Yeah. It's late in his life. Such a revolution would not by itself move the USSR into socialism, the lower phase of communism. It would still be a transition society, but the state would now be a worker state in the full sense of the term. A transitional society is a contradictory phenomenon. Lenin summed it up this way, quote, theoretically, there can be no doubt that between capitalism and communism there lies a definite transition period, which must combine the features and properties of both these forms of social economy, end quote. Lenin. Because features of both capitalism and socialism exist in a transitional formation, it is possible, by emphasizing some features rather than others, to construct a case that the Soviet Union is socialist, and it is also possible to construct a case that it is capitalist. This keeps a lot of Marxists busy refuting one position by asserting the other. As Trotsky put it, quote, "We often seek salvation from unfamiliar phenomenon in familiar terms," end quote. Because a transitional formation contains elements of both capitalism and socialism, it can develop in either direction. For the Soviet Union to become socialist, there would have to be 1. Socialist revolutions in the advanced capitalist countries, 2. A political revolution in the Soviet Union. The emphasis is mine, the reader, the speaker. That is, the social forces representing socialism would have to defeat the social forces representing capitalism on a world scale. Likewise, the Soviet Union could become capitalist if world capitalism survived for a long period of time. Due to the strength of the present Russian military machine, the restoration of capitalism in the Soviet Union by military means from outside is not too likely today. It is possible that some fraction of the bureaucracy will be able to convert the means of production into their private property and restore market regulation of the economy. There is constant pressure to move in this direction, and that pressure remains and intensifies so long as world capitalism survives. However, the working class would resist such a movement, since workers would be confronted with the threat of unemployment, so it's difficult to see this happening without upheaval and a crushing of the working class. In short, if capitalism is restored in the Soviet Union, it won't be done peacefully, and the restoration should be obvious. The key point here, then, is that the Soviet Union has not yet become socialist and has not yet become capitalist, although either could happen, and this outcome is linked to what happens on a world scale, and especially in the advanced capitalist countries. Let me see how long I've been reading here. "34 minutes. Rizzi's conception of the Soviet Union. New section. Besides the possibility of the Soviet Union becoming socialist or capitalist, it has often been suggested that the Soviet Union could become, or already has become, some new kind of class society. The question that is usually raised is, quote, "Does the bureaucratic domination of the Soviet Union constitute some new kind of class relation?" End quote. Certainly, bureaucratic domination in the Soviet Union is something different than bureaucratic domination in capitalist formations. In Trotsky's words, quote, "But the very fact of its appropriation of political power in a country where the principal means of production are in the hands of the state creates a new and hitherto unknown relation between the bureaucracy and the riches of the nation. The means of production belong to the state, but the state, so to speak, quote, belongs," end quote, "to the bureaucracy," end quote. Although Trotsky was, as the quote implies, quite aware of the uniqueness of the bureaucratic domination where the state owns the means of production, Trotsky did not consider the Soviet Union to be a new kind of class society. Further, contrary to many interpretations, Trotsky did not believe that the Soviet Union would become some new kind of class society. However, there have been a number of attempts to construct a fourth position that the USSR is a new kind of class society. The first argument of this type was developed by Bruno Rizzi. Rizzi saw what had happened in the Soviet Union as part of a larger process which he called the bureaucratization of the world. Rizzi saw the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, as well as, strangely enough, Roosevelt's welfare state, as variations of, quote, "bureaucratic collectivism," end quote, a new kind of class society which came after capitalism. In this framework, capitalism is not the last class society, but is followed by bureaucratic collectivism, which may be followed by socialism. To my understanding, Rizzi did believe that socialism would come after bureaucratic collectivism. which is why he urged, I think he believed, I'm not exactly sure, so this could be me talking out my ass, but I believe Rizzi, thought that the working class should support Stalin and Hitler on the grounds that they were um, establishing bureaucratic collectivist states, which would be superior forms of civilization that could be moved into a socialist direction later. I'm not exactly sure about that, but I believe that's Rizzi's perspective. Rizzi's conception developed in the context of the rise of fascism, the development of the welfare state, and the full blossoming of Stalinism in the 30s. It was a period in which the idea that capitalism was being replaced by something other than socialism seemed quite reasonable. However, Trotsky did not accept Rizzi's argument. Trotsky developed a critique of Rizzi's idea by stressing that, in classical Marxism, a post-capitalist class society was not possible. Trotsky's reply to Rizzi. Trotsky noted that, in classical Marxist theory, the system of exploitation controlled by each new ruling class raised the productive forces to a new level. Capitalism developed the forces of production more rapidly than any previous class system. Capitalism was, for Marxist theory, the last possible class system because it would develop the productive forces to the point where the freedom from labor for a few would no longer depend on the surplus labor of the many. A high development of the productive forces permits the possibility of reducing the realm of necessity to a minimum and, for the first time in history, expanding the realm of freedom, the time for the fullest development of each individual, to the entire population. Since capitalism can bring the development of the productive forces to the brink of automation, it is hard to imagine another class system which, through pumping surplus labor out of the direct producers, could further develop the productive forces. The only, quote, higher level of civilization, end quote, imaginable is socialism, the freeing of the creative capacities of all people on the basis of the highest level of development attained by capitalism. The alternative is the decay of civilization, which could take many forms, including some new system of domination and exploitation. But this could not be, quote, progressive, end quote, relative to capitalism, but only regressive. In classical Marxism, this possibility was called, quote, barbarism, end quote, the decay of civilization. Thus, it is possible that capitalism will end with fascism or something like fascism, emerging from the final attempt to prevent socialism. It is also possible, although Trotsky thought it unlikely, that socialist revolutions in the developed countries could degenerate into bureaucratic domination. In that case also, the answer to what comes after capitalism would be, quote, barbarism, end quote. Quote, Marxists have formulated an incalculable number of times the alternative, either socialism or return to barbarism, ... What social and political forms can the new, quote, barbarism, end quote, take? If we admit theoretically that mankind should not be able to elevate itself to socialism, we have the possibility of expressing ourselves on this subject more concretely than Marx. Fascism on one hand, degeneration of the Soviet state on the other, outline the social and political forms of neo-barbarism. The historical, end quote, Trotsky. The historical necessity of socialism is given by the fact that, in Marxist theory, is the alternative to barbarism. Barbarism is certainly a possible outcome in human history, and the kind of bureaucratic rule that exists in the Soviet Union could well be an aspect of that. However, Trotsky did not see the Soviet Union as a barbaric new kind of class society. Once again, the reason is that the USSR is the part of the capitalist world system and, due to pressures from the world market, military competition, and the like, bureaucratic domination within a single country does not lead to regression of the productive forces, even though it distorts development in various ways. Bureaucratic domination on a world level would probably lead to stagnation of the productive forces, including the creative capacities of humankind. But this does not yet exist, and Trotsky did not expect the bureaucratic rule in the Soviet Union to be expressed when socialist revolutions occur under more favorable conditions in the developed countries. In a way, Trotsky's position is that there cannot be socialism in a single country, and neither can there be barbarism in a single country. Either socialism or barbarism will come after capitalism, but that exists in what exists in capitalism, and it is either socialism or barbarism will come after capitalism, but what exists is capitalism, and it is premature to conclude that it has been replaced by something else. What exists today is the capitalist world system. Within that system are 1. Developed capitalist countries in which states take the form of the democratic republic. 2. Countries with a combination of various pre-capitalist modes of production and the capitalist mode of production and held together by some form of authoritarian state. 3. Countries in transition between capitalism and socialism, bureaucratically ruled worker states. Each is characterized by its unique internal contradictions reflecting its unique history and its location within the whole. Type 2 countries are good candidates for combined and uninterrupted revolution, which would move them from, quote, proto-capitalist, end quote, to formations to, quote, proto-socialist, end quote, formations. Such revolutions are historically, quote, progressive, end quote, and allow these countries to construct the prerequisites for socialism. The disintegration of Stalinism. During the period in which Stalinism dominated the way the Soviet Union was perceived, many Marxists, such as Bettelheim, accepted the argument that the Soviet Union was socialist despite the lack of democracy in the country, and hoped that development of the productive forces would lead to positive changes. The Sino-Soviet split led many of these theorists to reject the Russian claim that the Soviet Union was socialist and to look to China for their socialism. However, since China was even less developed than the Soviet Union, it was difficult to construct an argument that China could be socialist unless one could get rid of the troublesome problem of the level of development of the productive forces. Under the influence of Maoism, theorists such as Bettelheim have played down or ignored the importance of the productive forces. Bettelheim, in waging a war against the evils of, quote, economism, end quote, has rejected the argument that a high level of development of the productive forces is a prerequisite for socialism. Bettelheim correctly rejects the notion that development of the productive forces will automatically lead to socialism, which abstracts from the struggle between social forces, and adopts its opposite, which sees socialism as a result of class struggle, which abstracts from the productive forces. With politics in command, socialism can be built anywhere if the will is strong. Economism is replaced by voluntarism. Bettelheim knew that socialism could be constructed in a backward country because, quote, what is happening in China proves that a low level of the productive forces is no obstacle to a socialist transformation of social relations, end quote. The failure of the Cultural Revolution and the resulting fact that China was traveling the same path as the Soviet Union created a crisis for Bettelheim and others who had thought that socialism could be constructed even where the prerequisites for it did not exist. It turns out that a low level of development of the productive forces is a very big obstacle to a socialist transformation of social relations, and those who ignore that fact will face many a crisis. The importance of the theoretical frameworks. I have argued that the three major conceptions of the Soviet Union were constructed within the theoretical frameworks of the Kautskiist, Stalinist, and Trotskyist variants of Marxism. Each framework emerged as an attempt to make sense of a socialist revolution which occurred in a country where the level of development of the forces of production was lower than it was in the West. It is important to understand that the way theorists attempt to make sense of the Soviet Union is conditioned by a set of background assumptions which are derived from each of these frameworks. Even theorists who do not identify with a framework will start with some background assumptions derived from one or another of these frameworks. To understand this, it is necessary to examine the assumptions of each framework. The Kautskyist framework attempts to maintain the original orthodox Marxist idea that socialism will first appear in the West, and that until that time, non-Western societies can develop only by going through capitalism. Kautskyism is a Western-oriented Marxism which sees, quote, the West, end quote, leading the, quote, East, end quote. The level of development of the forces of production is the key to the possibility of constructing socialism, and therefore it is not possible for socialism to appear first in the less developed countries. Given this set of assumptions, theorists who, quote, think, end quote, within this framework will tend to see the major revolutions of the 20th century either as bourgeois revolutions or as their equivalent. This is not something restricted to whatever this Kautskyist framework he's talking about is. It's also something that would be shared. That's also a notion that would be shared by Pennacook. What emerges from these revolutions must be either capitalism or its equivalent. Any movement towards socialism in the East is excluded. It is not necessary for a theorist to identify with Kautsky in order to think within this framework. The key assumption of Stalinism is the idea that socialism can be constructed within a single country. Each country goes through capitalism, overthrows capitalism, and constructs socialism. Only after the nature of a country has been determined at the national level is there an attempt to determine its role in the world. Separate nations are, quote, capitalist or, quote, socialist, and these nations compete within the world. Since the nature of countries is determined at the national level, the problem of a, quote, socialism, end quote, which is at a lower level of development than capitalism, is glossed over. Since capitalism was first overthrown in the East represents the future while the West represents the past. The struggle between capitalism and socialism takes the form of a struggle between nation-states, with the West representing capitalism and the East, led by the Soviet Union, representing socialism. Stalinism is an Eastern-oriented Marxism which sees the revolutionary East struggling against the decadent West. I want to repeat that again because that seems very relevant. Stalinism is an Eastern-oriented Marxism which sees the revolutionary East struggling against the decadent West. The Trotskyist framework attempts to develop a theory of world revolution based on combined and uneven development. The first socialist revolutions occur in the East, where capitalism is weak, but these revolutions result in a hybrid social formation, where public ownership and planning are combined with a low level of development of the productive forces. This framework stresses totality, the capitalist world system, process, development of capitalism toward either socialism or barbarism, and mediation. The passage from one social form to another is mediated through transitional formations. Within this framework, the class nature of a country is determined both by its internal social relations and its place as part of the capitalist world system. Further, countries like the Soviet Union are examined in terms of a long historical epoch. Since the outcome of a long-range world historical transformation is still uncertain, it is not possible to make a final judgment about these countries. Attempts to construct a fourth position. Since the three original conceptions of the Soviet Union were developed, there have been constant attempts to construct a, quote, new conception. It seems to me that any attempt to see the Soviet Union as something other than capitalism, socialism, or a hybrid combination of the two must specify the relation of this, quote, new, end quote, society to capitalism and to socialism. Rizzi attempted to do this by asserting that, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, was replacing capitalism on a world scale. Bureaucratic collectivism was a new kind of society which existed historically between capitalism and socialism. It seems to me that all attempts to specify the relation of the society which exists in the USSR to capitalism and to socialism will wind up with either the Kautskyist, Stalinist, or Trotskyist theoretical frameworks. I will try to demonstrate this by looking at the recent conceptions by Melotti, Sweezy, and Barrow. Attempts to construct a fourth position. Since the three original conceptions of the Soviet Union were developed, there have been constant attempts to construct a, quote, new, end quote, conception. It seems to me that any attempt to see the Soviet Union as something other than capitalism, socialism, or a hybrid combination of the two must specify the relation of this, quote, new, end quote, society to capitalism and to socialism. Rizzi attempted to do this by asserting that, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, was replacing capitalism on a world scale. Bureaucratic collectivism was a new kind of society which existed historically between capitalism and socialism. It seems to me that all attempts to specify the relation of the society which exists in the USSR to capitalism and to socialism will wind up with either the Kautskyist, Stalinist, or Trotskyist theoretical frameworks. I will try to demonstrate this by looking at the recent conceptions of Melotti, Sweezy, and Barrow. A parallel to capitalism. Melotti, 1977, sees, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, as the type of society which follows societies characterized by the Asiatic mode of production in much the same way as capitalism follows feudalism in the West. East and West are characterized by parallel but different kinds of development. Rather than being something which follows capitalism, bureaucratic collectivism is a parallel to capitalism which occurs outside the West. This conception locates bureaucratic collectivism historically as a substitute for capitalism in the East, where capitalism never developed. For Melotti, both capitalism and bureaucratic collectivism will be followed by socialism, which will develop on a world level. This is an interesting conception which seems to solve the problem of where to locate bureaucratic collectivism relative to capitalism and to socialism. The problem, however, is that the relation between capitalism and bureaucratic collectivism and their respective ruling classes has not really been resolved. In a static framework, we might imagine the two systems in a state of coexistence with the two ruling classes having a peaceful relation while they each exploit the workers. As a process, however, the two systems would have to become similar, especially since both create the prerequisites for socialism. If bureaucratic collectivism is a parallel to capitalism, at a similar level of development, which develops the forces of production and creates the prerequisites for socialism, then it is not very different from capitalism. If both lead to socialism, then bureaucratic collectivism could be a special form of capitalism. The position is similar to that of Kautsky. For Kautsky, a different kind of capitalism, state capitalism, takes the place of normal capitalism in the East. For Melotti, a different kind of class society, bureaucratic collectivism, takes the place of capitalism in the East. Despite the different label that Melotti applies to the Soviet Union, Melotti's conception is constructed within the Kautskyist theoretical framework, where the Soviet Union is not theorized as a post-capitalist formation. Umberto Melotti, I believe the first name's Umberto, is categorized with Antonio Carlo under the heading critical Rizzi supporters under like the later section, like the 1970s and 80s section of Marcel van der Linden's Western Marxism and the Soviet Union. Their title is Critical Rizzi Supporters and Bureaucratic Collectivist Theoreticians. New section. A post-capitalist society, class society. In another recent formulation, Sweezy, in 1980, constructs his, quote, new class society, end quote, as a post-capitalist formation. An anti-capitalist revolution can lead either to socialism or to a new kind of class society. Sweezy's argument is constructed in two steps. First, Sweezy asserts the following, quote, the generally accepted Marxian interpretation of modern history leads us to expect that capitalism will be overthrown by proletarian revolutions, and that these proletarian revolutions will establish socialist societies. The theory, in fact, is so taken for granted as a reliable clue to what is happening in the world that every society which originates in a proletarian or proletarian-led revolution is automatically assumed to be and identified as a socialist society, end quote. Paul Sweezy. Sweezy then, quote, corrects, end quote, this theory by noting the overthrow of capitalism can give rise to a non-socialist society. Quote, having recognized this, we can then proceed along one of two lines. One, the hypothesis that the only alternative to socialism is capitalism, and two, the hypothesis that proletarian revolutions can give rise to a new form of society, neither capitalist nor socialist. I believe that the second line is the fruitful one, end quote. Sweezy then discovers a, quote, crisis in Marxian theory, end quote, because proletarian revolutions have not established socialist societies. Now, it is certainly not the case that Marxists assumed that every society which originates in a proletarian-led revolution is a socialist society. This was, and continued to be, assumed by Stalinism. Kautsky did not accept this proposition, and neither did non-Leninists in general. Among Leninists, Trotsky, of course, spent considerable time and energy arguing against such an idea. Sweezy, however, did make such an assumption, and that is why he is now facing a crisis. For Sweezy, the victory of socialism or the failure of socialism can be decided within the national limits of a single country. More than 40 years ago, in commenting on the, quote, socialism in one country debate, end quote, Sweezy accepted the proposition that socialism could be established in a single country. Now, Sweezy has discovered that socialism has not been established in any single country. Consequently, he has shifted to the opposite position that a new type of social order has been constructed in a single country. Sweezy, while not a Stalinist, thinks within the Stalinist theoretical framework and attempts to resolve the question of the nature of post-capitalist society on a national level. This is just a personal, maybe I'm wrong about this, but it seems like to say Sweezy is not a Stalinist seems a little bit it seems a little bit more simple than that. I'm pretty sure that I'm not an expert on this topic, but I'm pretty sure that the monthly review, which Sweezy was, like the main guy in, might not have been Stalinist in the sense of like, for one, they started publishing out after, I believe, I'm not sure, but they definitely were like cheerleaders for like third worldism, which usually took the form of Stalinism or some kind of reactionary form of nationalism. They were definitely about that. I can't comment much further on that, unfortunately, because I'm not an expert. But my impression is that, for instance, I think they were pretty pro Mao's China at the time until that became. Maybe they didn't ever stop being pro Mao's China. But, yeah. Not now. To be fair, though, I'm gonna also say is that that Monthly Review as a journal is not just a fucking Stalinist rag, regardless of whoever may contribute at different times. Monthly Review obviously publishes excellent material and offers excellent books. For instance, Michael Heinrich's books are all published in English uh, with Monthly Review, and they also published Daniel Gorin's book on anarchism in the 60s, and have published challenging material. Um, so I don't want to, for someone who's not familiar with them, I don't want to, paint an ugly picture before that kind of instills a prejudice against Monthly Review. That's not completely fair. Anyway, if one accepts the notion that socialism can be constructed within a single country, then it follows that the failure of socialism, the development of a new kind of class society, can also be determined within a single country. Background assumptions shape the way a theorist thinks and conditions the way a problem is approached. Quote, actually existing socialism, end quote, and quote, actually existing failure of socialism, end quote, are opposite conceptions constructed within the same theoretical framework. Proto-socialism, new section. Probably the most important of the recent conceptions of the Soviet Union is that developed by Barrow. Barrow sees the Eastern European countries as, quote, proto-socialist, end quote, societies, which create the prerequisites for socialism. Because there is public ownership of the means of production and economic planning, these societies are not capitalist. Commodities and money still exist. There is payment by both quantity and quality of labor, and there is a lack of democracy. Consequently, these societies are not socialist. The majority of the population is denied access to general labor. Those activities which permit the fullest development of the creative capacities of each individual. A privileged minority maintains a monopoly of administration and management. I can't remember precisely now, but I believe in van der Linden's Western Marxism in the Soviet Union. Barrow is categorized under new form of society without a consolidated ruling class, which it makes a distinction between both degenerated worker state theory. It's not a degenerated worker state theory. It's not a bureaucratic collectivist theory. It's not a state capitalist theory. It's not a bureaucratic collectivist theory. It's not a state capitalism theory. I don't even remember what I'm saying. It's not any of the main three ones that are associated with Trotskyism. So if you say like Trotskyism, Trotsky is degenerated worker state theory, and then say Castoriadis, Tony Cliff, Raya Dunayevskaya, CLR James, or state capitalists. It's not that, and it's not bureaucratic collectivist in the vein of like Carter and Shachtman and Burnham. Because, and what makes it different from Shachtman, Burnham, Carter, Rizzi, and so on, Crépieux and Pedrosa, is that they generally don't think that a consolidated ruling class is developed in the Soviet Union. I'd have to reread the book to be able to speak more confidently on that subject. The relationship between the privileged minority and the majority which performs necessary labor could be seen as a class relationship. However, Barrow does not interpret it this way. This is because Barrow does not abstract Eastern Europe from the world system, but rather sees the societies which developed in Eastern Europe as part of a world historical process which can lead to socialism. Let me look up Barrow real quick, actually, just for my own purposes. Rudolf Barrow was lived from 1935 to 1997 and was a dissident from East Germany who since his death has been recognized as a philosopher, political figure, and author. Barr was a leader of the West German party, the Greens, but became disenchanted with its political organization, left the party, and explored spiritual approaches to sustainability. It's the end of the thing for Barr on Wikipedia. There are differences between Barr's conception of the Soviet Union and the Trotsky-Mandel conception. Further, there are major differences between Barr's notion of a cultural revolution and the Trotsky-Mandel notion of a political revolution as the way to move from proto-socialism to socialism and communism. These differences can be seen in the review of Barr by Mandel. However, despite these differences, Barr's conception is constructed within the same general theoretical framework as that of Trotsky. Conclusion. A few conclusions about the Soviet Union and similar countries seem justified regardless of what label is applied to them. 1. These countries are going through the process of industrialization which in the center countries was accomplished by capitalism. They are going through a stage which parallels capitalism rather than one which follows capitalism. As in capitalist development, the prerequisites for socialism are being created but in a different way. 2. These countries are bureaucratically ruled, a political monopoly exists, and basic civil liberties are not allowed. 3. As the productive forces develop, this will not in itself lead to socialism, since the dominant social group, whatever the dominant social group is called, will attempt to maintain the existing social relations. A struggle between living social forces, however that is characterized, will be necessary to change the existing social relations. 4. The fate of these countries is linked to the fate of the capitalist world system. So long as capitalism continues to exist, no definitive conclusion can be drawn about the nature of the quote, post-revolutionary end quote, societies, since we do not know what they will become. Neither the complete victory of socialism nor the complete failure of socialism can be determined at the national level. 5. The debate about the nature of the Soviet Union will probably continue, since it is impossible to, quote, prove, end quote, that any one position is, quote, correct, end quote. When conflicts occur between the party/state apparatus and the working class in East European countries, the debates will intensify, as they did recently during the conflict in Poland, with the supporters of the Stalinist position losing some followers each time. Understanding these debates is complicated by the fact that the different conceptions of the Soviet Union are developed within different Marxist theoretical frameworks, which use some of the same words in different ways. Further, these frameworks involve different ways of, quote, thinking, end quote, the problem of the nature of the, quote, post-revolutionary, end quote, societies. Kautsky, Stalin, and Trotsky represent three possible ways of, quote, thinking, end quote, the problem. I have argued that recent theorists, despite their attempts to construct, quote, new, end quote, conceptions, tend to think within one of these frameworks. Thus Miloty, Sweezy, and Barrow, although they do not identify with Kautsky, Stalin, and Trotsky, tend to think the problem in ways similar to them. There are, of course, a number of important issues which need further development, such as the nature of the ruling social group and the laws of motion of the formations which exist in Eastern Europe and Asia. Many recent writers have contributed to this development. However, to understand what is going on in the debates about the Soviet Union, we need to understand the origin and background assumptions of the Kautskist, Stalinist, and Trotskyist variants of Marxism. This should hopefully contribute to a Marxism of Marxism. I'm just going to read the references. The essay's over, so you can click out if you want to. Turn it off. But the references are Rudolf Barrow's 1978, Alternatives in Eastern Europe, Charles Bettelheim's 1976, Class Struggles in the USSR, 1917-23, Hal Draper's 1977, Karl Marx's Theory of Revolution, State and Bureaucracy, Karl Kautsky's Terrorism and Communism, Lenin's Collected Works, Volume 32, Selected Works in 3 volumes, Ernest Mandel's Some Comments on H. Tichtin's Towards a Political Economy of the USSR in Critique. It's an essay. From Mandel's From Stalinism to Eurocommunism. Mandel's Trotsky, A Study in the Dynamic of His Thought. Mandel's The Class Nature of the Soviet Union, which is an essay. And Review of Radical Political Economics. We have Karl Marx's The First International and After, which is like I believe not a book by him, but a collection of his writings. Well, I know that it is. Umberto Melotti, see, I was right about it being Umberto. Marx in the Third World. Massimo Salvadori, Karl Kautsky and the Socialist Revolution, published in 1979. Joseph Stalin, 1976, Problems of Leninism, published by Peking Foreign Language Press. Paul Sweezy, The Theory of Capitalist Development, published in 1942. And Paul Sweezy, Post-Revolutionary Society. Then we have Hillel Tichtin's Toward a Political Economy of the USSR, which is an important essay and critique, which I have yet to read. And then we have a bunch of books by Trotsky, The Russian Revolution, The Permanent Revolution, The Third International After Lenin, The Revolution Betrayed, In Defense of Marxism. I have The Revolution Betrayed on this channel, if you're interested. And I'm also uploading the letters and notes and shit that are in Trotsky, the book In Defense of Marxism, which is just basically a bunch of critiques. I don't know. I won't say your opinion should be on them, but I don't think they're particularly enlightening, arguing against the theories put forward by the minority group within the Socialist Workers' Party USA, centered around Aburn, Burnham, Shachtman, and Carter. And he'd probably be young at this time, but also Julius Jacobson and Hal Draper, who are the minority versus the majority under the leadership of James P. Cannon and others. Anyway, thanks for listening.